Clara Sullivan knelt on the frozen floor, hands shaking, dividing 3 potato peels and a heel of stale bread among 5 tin plates. Her youngest smiled up at her like this was Christmas dinner. Clara smiled back, bright and warm, though her stomach had been empty for 2 days. She didn't know that outside, through a gap in the wall, a man sat on his horse in the falling snow, watching. And what he saw that night would change everything for both of them. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe to my channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. Garrett Thornton reined his horse hard at the edge of Bitter Creek. The iron-gray mare stamped and snorted, breath clouding white against the falling snow. His saddlebags hung heavy with supplies from Brennan's store: flour, salt, coffee, enough for a month on the ranch. He had no reason to stop, no reason to look through the warped slats of that leaning shack near the lumber yard. But the lamplight caught his eye. A flicker through the cracks. Movement inside. Garrett pulled the mare to a halt. Through the gap between planks, he saw her. A woman knelt on the bare floor. 5 children gathered around a table made from stacked crates. She wore a dress so faded the color had given up. Sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cold that seeped through every crack in those thin walls. On a chipped tin plate before her lay potato peelings. Bread heels, hard as river stones. Bacon grease scraped so thin from a pan it barely glistened. She divided these scraps with hands that trembled but moved precise. 5 small piles. 5 hungry mouths. "There now," she said, and her voice came bright as July sunshine through those frozen walls. "A fine supper for my fine children." The oldest girl touched her mother's sleeve. "Mama, you ain't eaten again." "I had plenty earlier, sweet girl. This is all for you." The woman smoothed the girl's hair back, gentle and steady, like nothing in the world was wrong, like she wasn't feeding garbage to her children, like the wind wasn't cutting through the walls, like her hands weren't shaking from hunger she'd hidden for God knows how long. Garrett's throat closed shut. He knew hunger, knew it personal, knew its face and its smell and the sound it made in a boy's belly at night when his mama thought he was sleeping. But he'd built himself past it. 300 acres of prime grazing land, barns full of cattle, a house with more rooms than one man could ever fill. He'd forgotten what hunger looked like on a mother's face. Until now. The youngest child, a boy no more than 3, clutched a potato peel in both fists and grinned up at his mama like she'd handed him gold. "Mama, this is the best supper ever." Clara Sullivan laughed. The sound hit Garrett square in the chest, warm and real and unbroken, the laugh of a woman who refused to let her children know they were starving. He backed his horse away slow, careful. The snow muffled the hooves, but his heart hammered loud enough to wake the dead. He rode toward the ranch as the last light bled from the sky. The land stretched wide around him, empty, prosperous, silent as a church on Monday. Mrs. Porter had set out roasted chicken with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread warm from the oven, preserved peaches glistening in a china bowl. Steam rose thick and fragrant. Garrett stared at the plate. Couldn't lift his fork. "Mr. Dawson having trouble with his appetite tonight." Mrs. Porter stood in the doorway, arms folded. "Thornton," he corrected, distracted. "It's fine. I ain't hungry." "You rode through a blizzard for 3 hours and you ain't hungry?" She didn't believe him. 5 years keeping his house had taught her when silence served better than questions. But tonight she lingered. "Something wrong, Mr. Thornton?" "Tell me something, Agnes." Garrett pushed the plate away. "You ever watch somebody go hungry while you sat at a full table?" Mrs. Porter's eyes narrowed. Can't say I have. I did. Tonight. He stood, chair scraping the floor. And I can't get the taste of this chicken out of my mouth because of it. He left the dining room. Mrs. Porter watched him go, concern etching deep lines across her weathered face. Garrett didn't sleep. He stood at the window of his study, watching snow fall across his prosperous land, and remembered things he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. His mother's hands, red and cracked from washing other people's laundry. The way she'd sing while she worked, voice bright like nothing was wrong, even when there wasn't a crumb in the house. The winter they'd had nothing, absolutely nothing, and he'd watched her face when she thought he wasn't looking, the quiet desperation she hid behind smiles. Then one morning, a 50-pound sack of flour appeared on their porch. No note, no name. Just flour that kept them alive until spring work came, and Martha Thornton found steady employment. He never learned who left it, but he learned what it meant. That sometimes mercy came from strangers, that goodness didn't need a name attached, that one person's quiet act could pull a family back from the edge of ruin. Garrett stopped pacing. Through the window, stars burned cold and distant. The snow kept falling. He made his inquiries careful the next morning, casual, like a man making conversation, not a man with a purpose burning in his chest. Jim Brennan sorted nails into bins at the Mercantile while they talked. Clara Sullivan? Keeps to herself mostly. Husband died near 2 years back. Mining accident up at the Silver Creek Claims. Terrible thing. She got family nearby? None that I know of. Jim measured out 10-penny nails, metal clinking against the scale. Came here with 5 young ones after her husband passed. Thought a fresh start might help. Can't say it has. She come in here much? Sometimes, for day-old bread. Pays what she can. Jim looked up from his work. Proud woman, that one. Won't take a handout to save her life. At the general store, Mrs. Hawkins leaned across the counter, voice dropping like she was sharing state secrets. Too proud for her own good, if you ask me. Church ladies took her a basket last Christmas. She thanked them polite as Sunday morning, but said she was managing fine. The older woman sniffed. Managing on scraps and stubbornness, more like. 5 children, Garrett said. She's feeding 5 children alone? 3 girls, 2 boys. Oldest one's maybe 10. Youngest barely walking steady. That woman's got more grit than sense, Mr. Thornton. But grit don't fill bellies. Garrett bought coffee he didn't need and left before his questions drew more notice. That night, the restlessness returned worse than before. He paced his study while wind howled against the windows and snow piled against the walls. 5 children, 3 girls and 2 boys. The oldest trying to read at church. The youngest grinning over potato peels like they were treasure. And Clara Sullivan, holding the whole thing together with nothing but stubborn pride and a mother's love. His mother's letter surfaced in his mind, the one he'd found tucked in her Bible after she died, written in her careful hand but never sent. To whoever left the flower, you saved my son's life. I will never forget your kindness. Garrett stood still in the dark room. Snow tapped against the glass. The letter had changed him when he'd found it at 19, standing over his mother's grave with nothing but grief and 2 strong hands. It had made him swear a silent oath. If he ever had the means, he'd be that person for somebody else. Well, he had the means now. More than enough. Before dawn, Garrett moved through his kitchen with purpose, hardening like frost in his bones. He filled the largest wicker basket he owned. Eggs packed careful in straw so none would crack. A 10-pound sack of flour. Bacon wrapped in butcher paper, thick slices from Bremen's best stock. Potatoes, 6 good ones without eyes or soft spots. 2 cans of milk, dried apples, a small sack of sugar that cost more than it should, but would let those children taste sweetness they'd probably forgotten existed. He wrapped everything in clean cloth, tied it with twine, left no note. The sky was still black when he saddled the mare. Stars faded at the edges, dawn an hour off. His breath clouded thick in the brutal cold as he rode toward town, the basket secured behind his saddle. No one stirred on the streets. Shops stood dark. Snow lay undisturbed on every porch and walkway. Garrett guided his horse through the back alley behind the lumber yard, approaching Clara's shack from the side where no windows faced. No smoke from her chimney. She'd be sleeping still, conserving firewood, stretching every stick of wood the same way she stretched every scrap of food. The thought put an ache in his chest that wouldn't ease. He dismounted quiet. Boots crunched on frozen ground. The basket felt lighter than it should, though it held more food than he'd eat in 3 days. He set it on her doorstep, adjusted the cloth so the wind wouldn't pull it loose. His hands shook, though whether from cold or something deeper he couldn't name. For a moment he stood there, imagined her opening the door at first light, finding abundance where there had been nothing. The shock on her face, maybe tears, the children gathering close, their wonder at eggs and flour and sugar, the relief of a mother who could feed her children something real today. Garrett retreated before the sky lightened. Back at the ranch, he stood in the barn as dawn broke gold and pink across the snow-covered land. The empty stalls, the silent house, the white fields stretching away in every direction. He'd built an empire, filled it with cattle and timber and profit, but nothing that mattered, nothing that breathed or laughed or called his name. "This ain't a one-time thing," he said aloud, to no one, to himself, to the ghost of his mother maybe. "I'm gonna keep bringing them until she don't need me to. Until those kids grow strong, until Clara Sullivan can divide plenty instead of scraps." The words settled into his bones like purpose. He walked toward the house as the sun climbed higher, warming the frozen world. For the first time in years, maybe since he'd finished building this ranch, the work ahead of him felt like it mattered. 2 weeks passed in a rhythm that gave Garrett's mornings a shape they'd never had. He woke before dawn, filled the basket while coffee brewed, rode different routes each day so nobody would track the pattern. North one morning, east the next. Once through the creek bed where cottonwood trees screened the path. He left the basket before light broke, before Clara woke, before the town stirred. The basket always came back empty. She left it on her doorstep, scrubbed clean, the cloth pressed flat with creases sharp enough to cut. Small signs of gratitude that said everything words couldn't. Then one morning, a wildflower appeared tucked in the handle, purple petals bright against brown wicker. It was barely the edge of spring, and flowers had no business blooming yet. She'd searched the creek banks in the snow and cold, found something growing against all odds. Left it as thanks she couldn't speak. Garrett pressed the flower between pages of his Bible, a fragile gift from a woman whose name he'd never said aloud to her face. He varied what he brought. Essentials always. Eggs, flour, bacon, milk. But other things too. A jar of honey, golden as sunlight. A tin of tea. One night, when sleep wouldn't come, he sat at his workbench and carved a small wooden horse for the boy. Jack, he'd learned the name was, sanded it smooth until the grain shone, tucked it among the potatoes. For Emma, the oldest girl, he wrapped a primer in oilcloth. He'd watched her at church, lips moving as she tried to read the Reverend's Bible from 3 pews back. The next week, he added a reader with simple stories, then a book of poems. because every child deserved beauty alongside survival. For Lucy, the quiet one who drew pictures on scraps of paper, he included a set of real drawing pencils. Nothing fancy, but better than charcoal stubs. For little Hannah, 4 years old with curls that bounced when she walked to church, he tucked in a small rag doll Mrs. Porter had helped him sew. He'd never tell a living soul he'd sat at a kitchen table stitching a doll's dress while his housekeeper tried not to smile. And for Sam, the baby, barely 3, who clung to Clara's skirts with eyes round as coins, Garrett carved a second wooden horse. Smaller than Jack's, just the right size for a tiny fist. The drawings started coming back with the baskets. Crude sketches on scraps of paper. A house with smoke curling from the chimney. Flowers in colors that didn't exist in nature. A family of stick figures holding hands. 7 of them now, not 6. The extra figure stood apart, taller than the rest, with something square in its hands. A basket. Garrett kept every drawing in his desk drawer. Sunday mornings he saw them at church. Clara sat in the back pew, 5 children scrubbed and neat despite threadbare clothes. She held her head high, sang hymns in a voice clear as creek water, accepted no pity from anyone. When their eyes met across the congregation, something passed between them. She didn't know it was him, but he could see her lips moving during silent prayer, hand pressed to her heart, praying for the stranger who'd kept her family alive. "You've been cheerful lately, Mr. Thornton," Mrs. Porter set breakfast down one Thursday, watching him with eyes that missed nothing. "Whistling while you work. Haven't heard that since I don't know when." "Spring coming," Garrett said. "Spring don't usually make a man whistle at 4 in the morning while packing a basket." She arched one eyebrow. "But I suppose that's none of my business." Garrett looked at her. She looked right back. Neither blinked. "No, ma'am," he said finally. "I reckon it ain't." Mrs. Porter smiled, just barely, and cleared the dishes without another word. One morning in the 3rd week, Garrett found a note tucked in the returned basket. The paper was rough, torn from an old book, the pencil letters careful and unsteady. Some words were misspelled. It didn't matter. "To my unknown friend, you have saved us. There are no words sufficient for such kindness. May God bless your generous heart and return to you tenfold what you have given. Your grateful recipient." Garrett stood in his barn, early light slanting through gaps in the boards, and read the note 4 times. His throat went tight. His eyes burned. He folded it carefully, slipped it into his coat pocket where it rested against his heart. That evening, he carved another toy, a small wooden bird, sanded it until the grain caught the lamplight. The baskets had started as duty, as debt owed to a nameless stranger who'd once saved a boy and his mother with a sack of flour. But somewhere between the first delivery and this woman's misspelled note, the feeling had shifted into something Garrett Thornton didn't have a name for yet. Something warmer than charity. Something that scared him more than any blizzard ever had. Something warmer than charity. Something that scared him more than any blizzard ever had. And Garrett Thornton, who'd faced down cattle thieves and drought and winters that killed half his herd, didn't know what to do with fear like this. So he did the only thing he understood. He kept bringing the baskets. The 4th week came in hard. A late-season storm rolled down from the mountains and buried Bitter Creek under 2 feet of fresh snow. Temperature dropped so low, the mercury in Peterson's porch thermometer froze solid. Cattle huddled against barn walls. Pipes burst. The creek stopped moving entirely, locked under ice thick enough to drive a wagon across. Garrett rode through it anyway. Dutch found him in the barn at 3 in the morning, saddling the mare by lantern light. "Boss, you ain't serious," Can't see 10 feet in this mess. I've ridden worse. When? In what life? Dutch pulled his coat tighter. Whatever you're doing out there before dawn every morning, it can wait one day. No, Garrett cinched the saddle. It can't. Dutch stared at him a long moment. Snow howled against the barn walls. You're gonna get yourself killed. Then I'll die doing something that matters. Garrett swung up into the saddle. Go back to bed, Dutch. Stubborn fool, Dutch muttered as Garrett rode into the white darkness. But he said it with something close to respect. The ride took twice as long in the storm. Garrett hunched low against the mare's neck, trusting the horse's instincts more than his own frozen eyes. Wind cut through his coat like it wasn't there. Snow drove sideways, stinging his face raw. He found Clara's shack by memory more than sight. Set the basket on the doorstep with hands so numb he could barely feel the handle. This time he'd packed extra. More firewood bundled and tied to the saddle. A thick wool blanket he'd pulled from his own bed, jerky and hardtack that would keep without cooking, in case her stove went cold. He was untying the firewood when the door opened. Garrett froze, flat against the wall, not breathing. Clara stood in the doorway, wrapped in a thin shawl, barefoot on the frozen boards. She held a candle that guttered in the wind. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, dark auburn catching the flame's light. She looked left, right, squinting into the storm. "Hello?" Her voice came small against the howling wind. "Is someone there?" Garrett pressed himself flat. His heart slammed so hard he was sure she could hear it. Clara stood there a long moment. Snow collected on her bare feet, on her shoulders, in her hair. She was shivering so hard the candle flame danced wild. Then she looked down, saw the basket, the firewood. Her free hand flew to her mouth. She knelt, right there on the frozen porch, in the snow, in her nightgown, and pulled back the cloth. Even in the dim candlelight, Garrett saw her face change. Saw something break open behind her eyes. Relief and wonder and grief, all tangled together in a way that made his chest crack wide. "Oh, God," she whispered. "Oh, thank you. Thank you." She pressed the basket to her chest like it was a living thing, like it was the most precious thing she'd ever held. Tears ran down her cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. Then she saw the firewood and the blanket. Clara Sullivan, who never cried where anyone could see, who held her head high in church while the whole town whispered, who told her starving children that potato peels were a feast, put her face in her hands and sobbed. The sound went through Garrett like a blade. He wanted to step forward, wanted to say her name, wanted to wrap that blanket around her shoulders himself and carry her inside where it was warm. But he stayed pressed against the wall, because this wasn't about him. This was about her, about letting her have this moment of relief without the burden of knowing who to thank, who to owe, who to feel beholden to. Clara gathered the firewood in her arms, made 2 trips, carried the basket last, pressing the door shut behind her with her hip. Through the thin walls, Garrett heard her moving. The clank of the stove door, the crack and snap of fresh wood catching flame. Then her voice, thick with tears but trying to be steady. "Emma, Emma, wake up, sweet girl. We got firewood, real firewood. And look, there's bacon and eggs and flour." A child's sleepy voice. "From the angel again, Mama?" "Yes, baby, from the angel again." "Mama, are you crying?" "Happy tears, sweet girl. Only happy tears." Garrett stood in the storm until his legs went numb. Then he rode home through white darkness, frozen solid from hat to boots, and didn't feel the cold at all, because something inside him, burned so hot, nothing could touch it. He sat at his kitchen table as dawn struggled gray through the storm. Mrs. Porter found him there an hour later, still in his wet coat, staring at nothing. "Lord have mercy." She took one look at him and started heating water. "You look half dead." "I'm fine." "You ain't fine. You're frozen through and sitting in a puddle of snowmelt on my clean floor." She set a cup of hot coffee in front of him. "Drink that before you catch your death." Garrett wrapped his hands around the cup. The heat stung his numb fingers. "Mr. Thornton." Agnes Porter sat down across from him. She never sat down. In 5 years of keeping his house, she'd never once sat at his table while he was in the room. "I've worked for you since you built this place. Never asked your business, never pried." "I know that, Agnes." "But I'm asking now." Her voice was firm but kind. "What's got hold of you?" Garrett looked at her. This woman who'd watched him build his fortune and live alone inside it, who pressed his shirts and cooked his meals, and never once asked why a man with everything seemed to have nothing. "You remember the Sullivan widow?" he said. "Lives in that shack by the old lumber yard? 5 children, husband killed in the mines. I know of her. She's been feeding those kids potato peels and bread heels, dividing scraps like it's a banquet and smiling while she does it." His voice roughened. "Her youngest don't even know he's starving, Agnes. He thinks his mama's giving him a feast." Mrs. Porter was quiet for a long moment. "And the baskets you've been packing every morning? You knew? I ain't blind, Mr. Thornton, and I ain't deaf. Hard to miss a man raiding his own pantry at 4 in the morning." She folded her hands. "How long?" 4 weeks. "She know it's you?" "No, and I aim to keep it that way." Agnes studied him with eyes that had seen plenty of life and most of its sorrows. "You're in love with her." "I'm helping her." "I said what I said." Agnes stood, pushing her chair back. "And for what it's worth, I think it's the finest thing you've ever done. Finer than this ranch. Finer than all your cattle and land put together." She paused at the doorway. "But you can't love a woman from behind a wall forever, Mr. Thornton. Sooner or later, you got to knock on the door." She left him sitting there with those words and his cooling coffee. Sunday came, and Garrett got to church early. He sat in his usual pew, 3rd row from the front, and waited. When Clara walked in with her 5 children, the air in his lungs went thin. She looked different. Still thin, still wearing the same faded dress, but something had changed. She carried herself straighter. Her children walked closer, more settled, less watchful. Little Sam clutched the wooden horse in his fist, the one Garrett had carved. Jack had the other horse tucked in his coat pocket, the head poking out. Emma held a book pressed to her chest, the primer Garrett had sent, and Lucy, the quiet one, had a drawing pencil tucked behind her ear, like she'd seen the schoolteacher do. Hannah bounced on her toes, whispering to her mother about something that made Clara smile. They filed into the back pew. Clara smoothed her children's hair, straightened collars, whispered reminders to sit still and listen. The practiced movements of a woman who held everything together through sheer will. Reverend Hayes began the service. Garrett tried to listen, failed entirely. His eyes kept drifting to the back of the church where Clara Sullivan sat with her head bowed during prayer, lips moving in words he couldn't hear but understood. She was praying for him, for the stranger who left baskets in the dark. When the hymn started, Clara sang. Her voice rose above the congregation, clear and true, and Garrett felt it in his bones. He gripped the pew in front of him until his knuckles went white. After service, the congregation spilled onto the church steps. Children ran between the wagons. Men talked about weather and cattle prices. Women gathered in clusters, trading gossip like currency. Garrett hung back, watching Clara help her children into their wagon. The ancient buckboard leaned to one side, the horse a sway-backed mare that had seen better decades. Emma climbed up first, then helped Lucy. Jack scrambled over the side. Clara lifted Hannah, then Sam, settling them in the wagon bed with a blanket tucked around their legs. "Mrs. Sullivan!" The words left his mouth before he knew he was going to speak. Clara turned, surprise flickering across her face. They'd never spoken directly, not once. "Mr. Thornton." She dipped her head, polite but guarded. Up close, her eyes were darker than he'd thought, brown and warm and deep, carrying a weight that would have broken a lesser woman. "Your girl there." Garrett nodded toward Emma, clutching her book. "She a reader?" Clara's guard tightened. He could see it happen, a door closing behind her eyes. "She's learning. My husband was teaching her before he passed." "Brennan's got some books gathering dust at the Mercantile. McGuffey's Readers, couple of primers, if she's interested." "That's kind of you, Mr. Thornton, but we manage fine." There it was, the wall she built around her pride. Same words she'd said to the church ladies. Same careful distance she kept from anyone who might see her need. "I'm sure you do, ma'am." Garrett tipped his hat. "Didn't mean to suggest otherwise." He turned to go, got 3 steps before Clara's voice stopped him. "Mr. Thornton?" He looked back. She stood by the wagon, 5 children watching from the bed, and something shifted in her expression. The guard cracked, just barely. "Emma reads every night by the lamp, whatever she can find. She'd be grateful for real books." Garrett nodded. "I'll have Brennan set some aside." "I'll pay for them, when I can." "No need, they're just collecting dust." "I pay my debts, Mr. Thornton." He held her gaze, brown eyes steady on gray. "Yes, ma'am, I reckon you do." He walked away before the conversation could deepen, before his face could betray what his heart already knew. In the wagon, Emma tugged Clara's sleeve. "Mama, who was that man?" "Mr. Thornton, owns the big ranch outside town." "He's the one who sits in the 3rd pew." Emma's voice carried the observation of a child who watched everything. "He looks at us during the hymns." Clara's hands stilled on the reins. "Don't be silly, Emma." "He does, Mama. Every Sunday. Lucy noticed too." Lucy nodded from the wagon bed, quiet as always, but missing nothing. Clara snapped the reins a little too hard. The old mare lurched forward. "He's just being neighborly. Don't make stories where there ain't none." But her cheeks flushed pink, and she didn't look back at the church, where Garrett Thornton stood watching her wagon rattle down the frozen road. That night, Garrett sat in his study and stared at Clara's note until the words blurred. "May God bless your generous heart." He traced the misspelled words with his finger. She'd written this by candlelight, struggling with letters her dead husband never finished teaching her. Every unsteady stroke cost her effort and pride. He pulled a sheet of paper from his desk, dipped his pen, stopped. What would he write? What could he say that wouldn't give him away? That wouldn't shame her or bind her with debt? He sat there for an hour, pen hovering. Finally, he wrote 3 words on a scrap of paper no bigger than his palm. "You are brave." He tucked it into the next morning's basket, nestled between the eggs and the flour. Let her think whatever she wanted about those words. Let her think it was God, or an angel, or a ghost with generous hands. It didn't matter who she thought he was. It mattered that she knew what he saw in her. The next evening, Dutch came to find him after supper. The old foreman stood in the study doorway, hat in hands, wearing the expression he saved for delivering bad news about cattle or weather. "Spit it out, Dutch." Mrs. Brennan's been talking. Garrett set down his coffee. She's always talking. This time, she's talking about you. Dutch shifted his weight. Noticed you've been buying supplies no bachelor needs. Extra eggs, extra flour, bacon every other day. She's been adding it up, boss, and her arithmetic ain't in your favor. Let her add. She's telling folks you're either keeping a secret woman or feeding the Sullivan widow. Either way, people are starting to pay attention. Garrett's jaw tightened. Since when do I answer to Ida Brennan? You don't, but this is a small town, and small towns got long memories and loud mouths. Dutch paused. I ain't telling you what to do. I'm telling you what's coming. I hear you. Dutch nodded, put his hat back on, and left. Garrett sat alone in the lamplight, Dutch's warning circling his mind like a hawk over open ground. He thought about stopping. For one cowardly moment, the thought crystallized clear and sharp. Stop the baskets. Let the church board handle it with their committees and their forms and their pitying smiles. Save his name. Then he imagined Clara's face finding the doorstep empty tomorrow morning. Imagined her standing in the cold, searching for the basket that wasn't there. The moment she'd understand she'd been abandoned again. First her husband, taken by a mind collapse. Now her unknown friend, taken by the fear of gossip. Imagined Hannah asking why the angels stopped coming. Imagined Sam clutching his wooden horse, hungry again. Garrett pulled on his boots, walked to the kitchen, and started packing tomorrow's basket. To hell with Ida Brennan. To hell with all of them. He had flour to deliver and children to feed, and a debt to a nameless stranger that he'd keep paying until the account was settled. And if the whole town wanted to talk, let them wear their tongues to nubs. Some things mattered more than reputation. Some things mattered more than anything a man could own, or build, or name. Garrett set the basket by the door, ready for morning. Then he sat in his chair by the fire, pulled Clara's note from his pocket, and read it one more time. You have saved us. He folded it careful, pressed it back against his heart. Not yet, he said to the empty room, but I'm trying. Not yet, he'd said to the empty room, but I'm trying. And he kept trying. Through the 5th week and into the 6th, Garrett packed baskets and rode through darkness and left abundance on Clara Sullivan's doorstep without a word. The routine had become the truest thing in his life, truer than cattle counts or land deeds or the ledger books that proved his wealth in numbers. But Dutch was right. Something was coming. It started at Brennan's Mercantile on a Tuesday. Garrett was buying supplies. More eggs than one man could eat in a month. Another sack of flour, though he'd bought one 3 days prior. Bacon, dried fruit, tea, 2 cans of milk. He set it all on the counter without thinking about how it looked. Ida Brennan stood behind the register, watching him with eyes that tracked every item, like a bookkeeper tallying sins. That's considerable provisions for a bachelor, Mr. Thornton. I eat considerable, ma'am. Eggs, flour, bacon, sugar, and milk? She counted each item with a pointed finger. And this is the 3rd time this month you've bought this exact list. A person might wonder who's eating all that food. Garrett laid his coins on the counter. A person might mind her own business. Ida's smile went thin as wire. Just making conversation, Mr. Thornton. He gathered his purchases and left. But he felt her eyes following him out the door, felt them drilling into his back all the way down the street. Ida Brennan had the sharpest tongue and the loosest lips in Bitter Creek. If she hadn't already started talking, she would before sundown. By Thursday, the whispers had spread like fire and dry grass. Garrett heard them in fragments, pieces of conversation that stopped dead when he walked past. At the feed store, 2 ranch hands went silent mid-sentence, suddenly fascinated by a pile of bridles. At the post office, Mrs. Hawkins and her sister turned away too quick. their hushed voices carrying one word he caught clear: Sullivan. On Friday, he rode into town for fence wire and found 3 women clustered outside the general store. They scattered when they saw him coming, but not before he heard Ida Brennan's voice carrying sharp in the cold air. Buying supplies no single man needs, leaving his ranch before dawn every morning. You tell me what that looks like. Maybe he's got a sweetheart somewhere, another woman said. Sweetheart, Ida snorted. He's leaving things for that Sullivan woman. Mark my words. And we all know what a wealthy bachelor wants from a poor widow with no family to protect her. The words hit Garrett like a fist. He pulled the mare to a stop. The women saw him and went pale. Ladies? His voice came flat and cold as the frozen ground beneath them. Ida recovered first. Mr. Thornton, we were just discussing the weather. Sounded like you were discussing my business, Mrs. Brennan, and getting the facts wrong while you did it. Her chin lifted. Facts have a way of speaking for themselves. Garrett looked at her until she dropped her eyes. Then he rode on without another word. But the damage was done. Ida Brennan's speculation would reach every ear in Bitter Creek before supper. By Sunday, it would be gospel. That evening, Dutch confirmed what Garrett already knew. They were in the barn, checking on a mare about to foal, when the foreman cleared his throat with a careful deliberation of a man handling something breakable. It's worse than I figured, boss. Tell me. Half the town thinks you're courting the Sullivan widow in secret. The other half thinks something less honorable. Dutch's weathered face showed genuine concern. Mrs. Brennan's saying you're taking advantage of a woman with no means to refuse, that you're buying her with groceries. Garrett's hand clenched on the stall gate so hard the wood groaned. That's a filthy lie. I know that. You know that. But folks who don't know, you're going to believe what they want to believe. And right now, what they want to believe ain't pretty. I haven't spoken to Clara Sullivan more than once in my life. At church, in front of 50 people. Don't matter. The story's got legs now. Dutch spat tobacco into the straw. Reverend Hayes was asking about you after service last week. Casual-like, but pointed. Wanted to know if you'd been keeping company with anyone. Garrett stared at the lantern hanging from the beam. Its flame wavered, throwing shadows that jumped and twisted against the walls. What do you think I should do, Dutch? Ain't my place to say. I'm asking. The old foreman was quiet a long time. I think you're the most decent man I ever worked for. And I think what you're doing for that woman and her kids is the kind of thing they preach about on Sundays, but nobody actually does. He paused. I also think this town will eat you alive if you let it. So I should stop. I didn't say that. I said you should know what's coming. Garrett nodded slow. They finished checking the horses in silence. Sunday morning arrived cold and bitter. Garrett dressed for church with the same care he always took, but his hands were unsteady on his collar buttons. He rode into town with his jaw set and his stomach churning. The congregation was already filling the pews when he walked in. Conversations dimmed, eyes followed him. Not all of them, but enough. Ida Brennan sat in the 4th row with her husband, and she leaned to whisper something to Mrs. Hawkins as Garrett passed. They both looked at him with expressions that mixed curiosity and satisfaction. Clara was already in the back pew. 5 children pressed close, scrubbed and combed. Emma had the primer open on her lap. Lucy sat quiet with her drawing pencil. Jack fidgeted. Hannah braided Sam's hair into a knot while he squirmed and clutched his wooden horse. Clara's eyes met Garrett's for one brief second as he walked to his seat. Something flickered in them. Recognition of the tension in the room, the weighted glances, the whispers that followed him like a shadow. She knows, Garrett thought. She can feel it too. Reverend Hayes preached about charity and its proper expression. The words felt aimed like arrows. True generosity, the Reverend said, gripping his pulpit, operates within the boundaries God has established. It flows through the channels of community, through the church, through the guidance of elders who ensure that charity uplifts rather than corrupts. Garrett sat rigid in his pew, blood heating under his collar. When we step outside those boundaries, the Reverend continued, even with the best intentions, we risk creating obligations that burden the very people we seek to help. We risk appearances that damage reputations, both the givers and the receivers. 2 rows behind him, Garrett heard Ida Brennan whisper, Amen. After the service, Reverend Hayes intercepted Garrett on the church steps. His handshake was firm, his smile careful. Mr. Thornton, might I have a word? In private. They walked to the side of the building, out of earshot, but not out of sight. Half the congregation watched from the corners of their eyes, while pretending to mind their own affairs. I'll be direct, the Reverend said. There are concerns. Concerns. About your involvement with Mrs. Sullivan. My involvement. Garrett kept his voice level, though every muscle in his body had gone taut. What involvement would that be, Reverend? I'm not accusing you of anything improper, Mr. Thornton, but this is a small town, and appearances carry weight. A man of your means, privately providing for a young widow. You must see how it looks. I see a town full of people who let a woman and 5 children nearly starve while they sat in warm houses with full tables. That's what I see. The Reverend's expression tightened. The church has systems for helping those in need, committees, proper oversight. If Mrs. Sullivan requires assistance, we can arrange it through appropriate channels. Your appropriate channels offered her 1 basket at Christmas and the heap of judgment to go with it. She's been hungry since October, Reverend. Where were your committees then? Hayes drew himself up. That's hardly fair. Fair. Garrett almost laughed. You want to talk about fair? That woman works herself half to death every day. Washes laundry for pennies, scrubs floors for people who gossip about her behind her back. She feeds her children scraps and tells them it's a feast. And she does it all without asking a soul for help. And now the town wants to punish her because someone showed her kindness? That's what you call fair? No one's punishing anyone. I'm simply suggesting that future assistance be channeled through the church board, where it can be managed properly and transparently. And I'm simply telling you that I'll handle my affairs as I see fit. The Reverend's jaw worked. Mr. Thornton, I'm trying to protect you. And Mrs. Sullivan. She don't need protectin' from me, Reverend. She needs protectin' from this town. Garrett walked away. His boots hit the frozen ground hard with every step. Behind him, he felt the congregation's eyes, felt the weight of their judgment pressing down like a physical thing. Clara was loading her children into the wagon when he passed. She didn't look at him, but her back was stiff, her movements sharp, and her cheeks burned red. She'd heard something. Maybe not his conversation with the Reverend, but enough. The whispers, the glances, the sermon aimed like a weapon at both of them. He wanted to stop, wanted to tell her none of it mattered, that the town could choke on its gossip. But he kept walking, because stopping now, speaking to her now, in front of all these watching eyes, would only make it worse. That afternoon, Clara went to Hawkins' store for thread. She needed it for patching Jack's coat, the one with the torn elbow that let the cold in. She counted her coins 3 times before entering, making sure she had enough. Mrs. Hawkins stood behind the counter with another woman. Their voices were pitched low, but carried clear across the small shop. That Thornton rancher's been buying enough food for a family of 6. Eggs and flour and bacon, same as what's been showing up on certain doorsteps. Well, the other woman said, and the word dripped with meaning heavy as poison. I suppose a widow with 5 mouths to feed can't afford to be particular about where her help comes from, or what it costs. Clara's hands went cold. The thread she'd come for blurred in her vision. Mrs. Hawkins noticed her standing there, had the decency to look embarrassed at least. Mrs. Sullivan, I didn't hear you come in. I need white thread. Clara's voice came out steady. She was proud of that. 1 spool. Of course. Mrs. Hawkins wrapped the thread, took the coins. Their fingers didn't touch during the exchange. Have a pleasant afternoon. Clara walked out without looking back. She made it 3 blocks before her legs started shaking. She pressed her back against the wall of the feed store and breathed deep until the trembling stopped. They thought she was selling herself. That was what the whispers meant, what the glances said, what the sermon had been about. The whole town believed she'd traded her dignity for a basket of eggs. Shame burned through her like acid, followed immediately by rage. She hadn't asked for the baskets, hadn't sought them out, hadn't done a single thing wrong except be poor and accept help from someone kind enough to offer it without conditions. And now the town wanted to make it filthy. That night, Clara sat at the crate table after the children fell asleep and stared at the empty doorstep. Tomorrow morning, the basket would come. It had come every morning for 6 weeks without fail. But now the gift carried weight it hadn't before. Now accepting it meant accepting the town's judgment, their knowing smirks and whispered accusations. She thought about leaving the basket untouched, letting it sit there until whoever brought it understood she couldn't take it anymore. Then she looked at her children. Emma curled around Lucy in one bed. Jack sprawled across the other, one arm flung out, the wooden horse on his pillow. Hannah and Sam slept tangled together under the wool blanket that had appeared in the basket 2 weeks ago. Their faces were fuller now. Their cheeks had color. Jack had grown half an inch. Sam wasn't crying from hunger in his sleep anymore. Clara put her face in her hands. She couldn't refuse the baskets. Not when refusing meant watching her children shrink back to bone and hollow eyes. Not when she'd already seen the difference between enough and nothing. But she couldn't accept them either, not with the whole town watching and counting and making her something she wasn't. The choice felt like being torn in half. Morning came gray and cold. Clara opened the door to find the basket waiting as always. The cloth was damp with snow. She brought it inside fast, before any neighbors could see, and hated herself for the furtiveness, for hiding kindness like it was something shameful. Inside the basket, beneath the eggs and flour, she found a scrap of paper. 3 words in careful handwriting. You are brave. Clara read it 7 times. Then she sat down on the floor and cried so hard her ribs ached. Because she didn't feel brave. She felt trapped, caught between hunger and pride, between her children's needs and a town's cruelty, between gratitude for a stranger's mercy and fury that mercy could be made into something ugly. She folded the note and pressed it against her heart. Across town, Garrett Thornton sat at his desk and tried to write a letter to the Reverend. 3 drafts went into the fire. The words kept coming out wrong, too angry, too defensive, too much like a man explaining himself to people who'd already made up their minds. He gave up on the letter and started packing the next basket instead. His hands moved through the routine while his mind churned. Dutch's warning, the Reverend's lecture, Ida Bremen's poison tongue. The weight of a whole town pressing down on something that had started as simple goodness and been twisted into scandal. He could stop. The thought came clear and cold, and for one terrible moment, he let himself consider it. He could stop bringing baskets. Let the church board take over with their forms and procedures and the careful condescension that made charity feel like punishment. He could save his reputation, protect his standing, go back to being the respected rancher everyone admired. All he had to do was abandon a woman and 5 children to hunger. All he had to do was become the kind of man who let gossip matter more than a child's full belly. Garrett stared at the basket, at Clara's note still in his pocket, at the children's drawings tucked in his desk drawer, Emma's careful letters, Lucy's purple flowers, Jack's horses running wild across scraps of paper, Hannah's stick-figure family with a tall man holding a basket, Sam's wobbly circles that might have been faces or sons, or just a small boy's joy at having a pencil. He thought about his mother, about the flour sack on the porch, about the person who'd left it without a name, without explanation, without caring what the neighbors thought. That person hadn't stopped when it got hard, hadn't weighed reputation against righteousness, had simply done what needed doing and walked away. Garrett closed his eyes. When he opened them, his hands were already reaching for the eggs. He packed the basket with more care than usual, added extra bacon, a jar of preserved peaches from his own cellar, a pouch of peppermint candy for the children, and at the bottom, wrapped in a clean handkerchief, a small gold locket he'd found in his mother's things. Simple and plain, worth more in meaning than money. He didn't know why he included it, didn't let himself think too hard about what it meant, giving a piece of his mother to a woman he'd barely spoken to. Some things didn't need explaining. Some things just needed doing. Before dawn, he saddled the mare. This time he didn't take the back alleys, didn't cut through the creek bed or hide behind buildings. He rode straight down the main road as the sky went from black to gray. The basket sat visible behind his saddle, where anyone looking out a window could see it plain. Let them see. Let them count the eggs and weigh the flour and add up whatever ugly arithmetic they wanted. He was done hiding kindness like it was a crime. The cold bit at his face as he rode. His breath clouded white. The town slept around him, but he could feel it watching, could feel the eyes behind curtained windows, the judgments forming in darkened rooms. He reached Clara's shack, set the basket on the doorstep, adjusted the cloth. Stood there a moment longer than he should have, his hand resting on the wicker handle. "I ain't stopping," he said quiet, to the closed door, to the sleeping woman behind it, to the 5 children dreaming inside. Not for the Reverend, not for Ida Brennan, not for any of them. You hear me, Clara Sullivan? I ain't stopping. The wind carried his words away. Snow began to fall again, soft and steady, covering his boot prints as he walked back to his horse. He mounted up and rode toward home. Behind him, the basket waited on the doorstep like a promise kept, like a line drawn in the snow, like a quiet man's declaration that some things were worth more than the whole world's approval. And in the growing light, through a crack in the shutter she'd opened just enough to see, Clara Sullivan watched him go, watched his broad back disappear into the falling snow, watched until he was gone and the road was empty, and the only proof he'd been there was the basket on her porch and the ache in her chest that had nothing to do with hunger. She pressed her hand to her heart where his note rested. "You are brave," she whispered to the empty road. Then she opened the door, gathered the basket close, and carried it inside to feed her children. She opened the door, gathered the basket close, and carried it inside to feed her children. But something had changed in the gathering between her ribs, because now she had a face to put with the kindness. Now she knew. Clara set the basket on the crate table, hands trembling. She'd seen him through the shutter crack, seen his broad shoulders, and the way he stood at her door like a man trying to say something his mouth couldn't manage. She'd recognized the horse first, the iron-gray mare from church. Then the coat, the hat, the way he held himself like he was carrying something heavier than a basket. Garrett Thornton, the quiet rancher from the third pew, who'd asked about Emma's reading, who'd looked at her with gray eyes that held no pity, only something she couldn't name. "Mama?" Emma stood in the doorway of the curtained sleeping corner, rubbing her eyes. "Is the angel here?" Clara's throat closed. "Go back to sleep, sweet girl. You're crying again." Happy tears. Always happy tears. Emma padded over in bare feet and looked into the basket. Her eyes found the book first, as they always did. This time it was a collection of fables, the spine cracked but the pages clean. She pressed it to her chest. Then she looked at her mother with the two old eyes of a child who understood more than any 10-year-old should. "You know who it is, don't you, Mama?" Clara wiped her face with the back of her hand. "What makes you say that?" "Because you're crying different today, not like before." Clara pulled her oldest daughter close, held her tight, breathed in the smell of her hair, which still somehow smelled like childhood, despite everything. "You're too smart for your own good, Emma Sullivan." "Is it Mr. Thornton?" Clara went still. "Why would you say that?" "Because he looks at us in church like he's counting to make sure we're all there. Like he's checking we're okay." Emma pulled back, studying her mother's face. "And because the book started coming after he talked to you that Sunday, the day he asked if I was a reader." Clara stared at her daughter. This girl who'd lost her father at 8, who'd walked across 2 territories with her mother and 4 siblings, who read by lamplight and taught her younger brothers and sisters their letters, who noticed everything and complained about nothing. "Even if it is him," Clara said carefully, "it don't change anything. We don't take charity, Emma." "It ain't charity, Mama. Charity makes you feel small." Emma held up the book of fables. "This don't feel small. This feels like somebody paying attention." Clara couldn't speak for a moment. Her 10-year-old had just put words to the thing she'd been circling for weeks. The baskets never felt like pity, never felt like obligation. They felt like someone had looked at her family and seen what they needed, not just food, but dignity. Books for Emma, pencils for Lucy, toys for the little ones. The note that said, "You are brave." Someone paying attention. "Get your brothers and sisters up," Clara said finally, her voice rough. "We got eggs this morning, real eggs." The next Sunday, Garrett sat in his usual pew and tried not to watch the door. He failed. When Clara walked in with her 5 children, his breath caught the same way it did every week, and every week it surprised him. But today, something was different. Clara didn't go to the back pew. She walked 3 rows further forward than usual and sat her family down in the middle of the church, directly in the sightline of Ida Brennan. Her chin was up, her back straight as a fence post. 5 children arranged beside her, scrubbed and neat. She was done hiding in the back. Garrett watched her settle the children, watched her fold her hands in her lap and fix her eyes straight ahead. She didn't look at him, didn't need to. The act itself was a statement louder than any words. After service, Garrett moved through the congregation toward the door. He was 3 steps from the exit when a small hand grabbed his coat. He looked down. Sam Sullivan stared up at him with enormous brown eyes. The wooden horse was clutched in his other fist, held up for Garrett to see. "Mister, did you make thunder?" Garrett's heart stopped. He knelt down, eye level with the boy. "What's that, son?"
My mama said the angel made thunder.
Sam held the horse higher.
But angels don't use sandpaper. I can see the marks.
From 3 feet away, Clara made a small sound. Garrett looked up. Their eyes met, and in that single second, everything unspoken passed between them. She knew. He could see it in her face, in the way her hand pressed against her heart where his note rested. She'd known, and she hadn't stopped him. Hadn't refused the baskets, hadn't turned him away. "Sam?" Clara's voice came quiet but firm. "Come here, please." The boy obeyed, but he looked back over his shoulder at Garrett with those round, knowing eyes. Garrett stood. His knees felt weak. Around them, the congregation swirled, oblivious to what had just passed between a rancher and a widow's youngest son. Or maybe not oblivious. Maybe just pretending. He left the church without speaking to anyone. His hand shook all the way home. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Garrett lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, while his mind turned over the same question from every angle. She knew. What did that change? Everything? Nothing? He got up, paced the study, pulled out every drawing, every note, every pressed flower Clara and her children had left in the basket. Spread them across his desk, like evidence in a trial. Emma's careful letters, Lucy's purple flowers, Jack's wild horses, Hannah's stick-figure family, Sam's wobbly circles, and Clara's note, creased soft from being read 100 times. "You have saved us." Mrs. Porter found him at his desk at dawn, still dressed, surrounded by children's drawings.
You look like a man about to do something either very brave or very stupid, she said from the doorway.
Maybe both. Usually is, with men. She brought coffee, set it in front of him, looked at the drawings spread across the desk, and said nothing about them. "You're going to tell her." "I'm going to do more than tell her." Garrett met her eyes. "I'm going to ask her to marry me." Agnes Porter didn't gasp, or argue, or tell him he was a fool. She looked at him steady for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "About time." "You think I'm crazy." "I think you've been half alive for 10 years, Mr. Thornton. I think that woman and her children woke you up. And I think if you don't go to her today, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what would have happened if you had. The town will talk. The town's been talking for weeks. They'll talk whether you go or not. Might as well give them something worth talking about." She paused at the door. "Wear your good coat." Garrett rode into town at mid-morning. No basket this time. Just himself, his good coat, and a heart beating so hard it echoed in his ears. He hitched the mare outside Clara's shack and stood on the porch for a full minute, fist raised to knock, unable to make his hand move. Inside, he heard the children. Jack's voice, loud and cheerful. Emma reading aloud. Lucy whispering something to Hannah that made the little girl giggle. Sam making horse sounds running across the floor. And Clara, singing something low and sweet while she worked. A hymn, maybe. The melody came through the thin walls like a lifeline. Garrett knocked. The singing stopped. Footsteps approached. The door opened. Clara stood there in her faded dress, hair pulled back, hands dusted with flour. 5 children froze behind her in various poses of play and study, all of them staring at the man on their porch. "Mr. Thornton." Clara's voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "Mrs. Sullivan."
"May I come in?"
She stepped back. The children scattered to the edges of the room, watching with wide eyes. Sam peeked from behind the curtain. Jack stood protectively near his sisters. Emma watched from the table, her book still open, her gaze sharp and assessing. Garrett removed his hat. The shack felt even smaller with him in it. 1 room for 6 people. Clean, organized, fiercely maintained. but small. God, so small. Sit down, please. Clara gestured to the crate table. I'll make coffee. We have coffee now. She said the last part with a ghost of a smile. Somebody's been leaving it on our doorstep. Garrett sat. His hands found each other in his lap and held on. I reckon you know why I'm here. I reckon I do. Clara set a tin cup before him, poured coffee with hands that trembled just slightly. Sam gave you away. Sam's a smart boy. Too smart. Clara sat across from him. The table between them was the same crate table he'd seen through the slats that first night, when she'd divided scraps among 5 plates. But I knew before Sam. I saw you. That morning during the storm, when you brought the firewood. I opened the shutter and saw you riding away. Garrett's chest constricted. How long? 3 weeks. I've known for 3 weeks. And you didn't say anything. Clara looked at her hands. What would I say? Thank you? That ain't big enough. Stop? I couldn't. My children were eating again. They were sleeping warm. Her voice cracked. Hannah stopped asking why we couldn't have supper. Sam stopped crying at night. How do I tell a man to stop when his kindness is the only thing keeping my family alive? You don't. Garrett leaned forward. You never have to. The town thinks I'm a kept woman, Mr. Thornton. Garrett. The town thinks I'm selling myself for eggs and flour, Garrett. Mrs. Hawkins said it to my face.
Not in those words, but close enough.
Clara's jaw tightened. I have lived through my husband's death. I have walked 200 miles with 5 children and nothing but what I could carry. I have fed my babies garbage and called it supper. I have survived things that would have broken women with twice my resources. And the hardest thing, the thing that nearly destroyed me, was hearing those women in that store suggesting I traded my honor for a basket of food. Clara, I am poor, Garrett Thornton. I am tired and poor, and I can't read proper, and I own nothing but 5 children and a shack with walls so thin the wind walks right through. But I have never, not once, compromised my dignity. And I won't have this town or anyone in it say different. Nobody who matters believes that, Clara. Everybody believes it. That's what gossip does. It don't need to be true to be real. They sat in silence. The children were statue still, listening. Even Sam had stopped moving. Garrett took a breath. I came here to say something, and I'm going to say it, and then you can throw me out if you want. Clara waited. Her brown eyes held his gray ones without flinching. I saw you through the wall of this shack 6 weeks ago, dividing potato peels for 5 children. You were smiling. You were shaking and starving and smiling like it was the finest meal ever served. And something broke in me, Clara. Something I didn't know was broken. He swallowed. I started bringing baskets because I knew what hunger looked like. My mama and I nearly starved when I was a boy. Somebody left us flour. No name, no note. Saved our lives. I swore if I ever could, I'd be that person for someone else. But it stopped being about the flour somewhere around the 3rd week. It stopped being about duty or debt or Christian charity. It became about you, about wanting to hear your voice, about watching you at church and wondering what you were praying for, about carving toys at midnight, because the thought of your children smiling gave me more joy than anything I've ever owned. He reached across the table. This time, he didn't stop himself. His hand covered hers. Her fingers were rough with work, thin from hunger, and the strongest thing he'd ever held. I love you, Clara Sullivan. Not because you're poor and I can help you. Not because your children need a father. Because you fed your babies scraps and made them believe it was a feast. Because you taught yourself to read from a primer meant for your daughter. Because you walked into that church last Sunday and sat 3 rows forward, and dared this whole rotten town to say one word about it. I love your stubbornness, and your pride, and your singing voice, and the way you look at your children like they're the most precious things God ever made. I love that your boy named a wooden horse Thunder. I love that your girl reads fables twice through. I love that Lucy draws pictures of a family with 7 people in it, and the 7th one is holding a basket. Clara's tears fell onto their joined hands. She didn't wipe them away. I'm asking you to marry me, not as charity, not as rescue, as partners, as equals. I have a house that's too quiet, and a table that's too big, and a life that's been too empty for too long. And you have 5 children who deserve room to run, and a mother who deserves to stop worrying about tomorrow. You don't know me, Clara whispered. Not really. Then let me learn. Let me spend every day learning. The town will never accept it. I ain't marrying the town. A sound escaped Clara, half laugh, half sob. I can't cook fancy. I don't know how to host dinners or talk to important people or run a big house. I don't need a hostess, Clara. I need a home. There's a difference. My children are wild. Jack climbs everything. Hannah asks 1,000 questions a day. Sam will put mud on your floors and horses in your bed. I built 6 bedrooms and never had a reason for any of them. Now I do. Emma stepped forward from the table. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. Mama. Clara looked at her oldest daughter. Say yes. Lucy appeared beside her sister, nodded once. Jack stepped out from behind the curtain, trying to look tough, but failing. Hannah bounced on her toes, not fully understanding, but feeling the electricity in the room. And Sam toddled forward, wooden horse in hand, and climbed straight into Garrett's lap like he'd always belonged there. Garrett froze. The boy weighed almost nothing. He smelled like soap and wood shavings from the horse he carried everywhere. He settled against Garrett's chest with the absolute trust of a child who'd already decided where he belonged. Mama, Sam pointed the horse at Clara. Thunder says yes. Clara pressed both hands to her mouth. Her shoulders shook. Tears streamed down her face in rivers she'd stopped trying to control. I can't give you anything, she said through her fingers. I have nothing. You have everything I need. Garrett's voice broke on the last word. You have everything I've ever needed. The door banged open. Reverend Hayes stood on the threshold, face tight with authority. Behind him, Mrs. Brennan and Mrs. Hawkins, and a half-dozen others who'd apparently followed Garrett's horse to the Sullivan shack. The crowd pressed close, necks craning, faces split between curiosity and judgment. Mr. Thornton, the Reverend stepped inside without invitation. I heard you'd come here. I think this has gone far enough. Garrett set Sam gently on the floor, stood to his full height. In the small room, he towered over the Reverend by half a head. You're right, Reverend. It has gone far enough. He turned to Clara, extended his hand. She took it, rose beside him. Mrs. Sullivan has agreed to become my wife. The crowd erupted. Gasps, whispers, Ida Brennan's sharp intake of breath. Now, Mr. Thornton, let's be reasonable. The Reverend raised his hands. This is exactly the kind of hasty decision that creates scandal. A man of your position, a woman of her circumstances. Garrett's voice cut through the noise like a blade. You mean her poverty. Just say it plain, Reverend. You mean she's poor and I'm rich, and that makes this improper. I mean, there are appearances to consider. I have considered them. I considered them every morning at 4 a.m. when I rode through blizzards to make sure her children had breakfast. Where were you at 4 a.m., Reverend? Where were any of you? He looked past Hayes to the crowd, met their eyes one by one. Ida Brennan, Mrs. Hawkins, old Peterson, the ranch hands, the shopkeepers, the church ladies who'd offered Clara one basket at Christmas and a year of whispers. This woman has been hungry in your town for months. Her children ate scraps while you all sat at full tables. Not one of you knocked on her door to ask if she needed help. Not one of you invited her children for a meal. You let her starve in silence, and then, when someone finally helped, you turned it into a scandal. The crowd shifted. Some faces flushed. Others looked at the floor. I ain't asking your permission. Garrett's voice dropped lower, steadier. I'm telling you what's happening. I love this woman. I love her children. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure they never go hungry again. If that offends your sensibilities, take it up with the God you preach about on Sundays. The one who said to feed the hungry and shelter the poor. The one none of you seem to remember Monday through Saturday. Silence. Heavy and absolute. Then old Peterson, standing at the back of the crowd, took off his hat. I think it's a fine thing, Mr. Thornton. Takes a man of real character to do what you done. A murmur moved through the crowd. Mrs. Brennan stepped forward. Her face had changed, the sharpness gone, replaced by something raw and ashamed. I owe you both an apology. What I said, the things I spread. She looked at Clara. I'm sorry, Mrs. Sullivan. You deserve better from me, from all of us. One by one, faces softened. Not all. Some stayed hard, arms crossed, lips thin. But enough. Enough for the balance to shift, for the tide to turn, for the weight of judgment to ease just enough to breathe. Reverend Hayes stood quiet through it all. When the murmuring faded, he cleared his throat, looked at Garrett, looked at Clara, looked at 5 children pressed close to their mother, watching the adults with eyes that had already seen too much. Perhaps, he said slowly, I have been too concerned with propriety and not enough with mercy. He removed his hat. If you'll have me, I'd be honored to perform the ceremony. Clara's hand tightened in Garrett's. Her voice came clear and strong, carrying across the room and out the door to every ear in the crowd. We'd be grateful, Reverend. Garrett looked down at her. This woman with flour on her hands and tears on her face and 5 children at her back and a spine made of something harder than iron. This woman who'd survived everything the world had thrown at her and still stood straight. You sure? He asked quietly, just for her. Clara Sullivan looked up at Garrett Thornton with brown eyes that held no fear. I've been sure since the morning you brought the firewood through a blizzard. Any man who rides through a storm to keep strangers warm is a man worth trusting with my heart. Sam tugged Garrett's coat, held up the wooden horse. Papa Garrett, Thunder wants to go home. Garrett lifted the boy into his arms. Sam weighed nothing and everything at the same time. Around them, the crowd had begun to thin, people drifting away with changed expressions. Some shamed, some moved, some quietly reconsidering everything they thought they knew about charity and love and the distance between them. Clara gathered her children close. Emma took Lucy's hand. Jack stood tall, trying to look like a man. Hannah slipped her small fingers into Garrett's free hand, the one not holding Sam, and held on like she'd been waiting her whole short life for someone to hold on to. They stood there in the doorway of the leaning shack, 7 people who'd been strangers 6 weeks ago, and felt something settle around them like the first true warmth after a long winter. Not just love, not just family. Home. Home. The word settled around them like the first warmth after a long winter, and it carried them through the days that followed. They married on a Thursday. No fuss, no grand ceremony. Just Reverend Hayes in the small church with Mrs. Porter and Dutch as witnesses. Clara wore a dress that Ida Brennan had altered to fit. The same woman who'd spread poison, now stitching kindness into every seam. She'd brought it to Clara's door 2 days after the proposal, eyes red, hands shaking, and said, I ain't much with apologies, Mrs. Sullivan, but I'm fair handy with a needle. Please let me do this." Clara had taken the dress, not because she'd forgiven Ida Brennan entirely, but because she understood that people changed the same way seasons did. Slow, uneven, but real when it happened. Garrett stood at the altar in his good coat, the one Mrs. Porter had pressed 3 times because his hands kept creasing it while he paced. His hair was combed, his boots were polished. His face carried the expression of a man who couldn't quite believe what was happening to him. The children sat in the front pew. Emma held Sam on her lap. Lucy clutched her drawing pencil, already sketching the scene on a scrap of paper. Jack sat straight, trying to look serious, failing because Hannah kept poking his ribs and whispering questions about whether they'd get cake. "Do you, Garrett James Thornton, take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife?" "I do." No hesitation, not a flicker of doubt. "And do you, Clara Marie Sullivan, take this man to be your lawful wedded husband?" Clara looked at Garrett, at this man who'd ridden through blizzards before dawn to leave food on her doorstep, who'd carved wooden horses at midnight, who'd tucked books into baskets because he'd noticed her daughter trying to read from 3 pews back, who'd stood in front of the whole town and chose her over his reputation without blinking. "I do." Her voice didn't waver. "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife." Garrett kissed her, gentle, careful, like she was something precious he'd been trusted to hold. Clara's hand came up to his cheek, rough palm against rough jaw, and she kissed him back with the quiet fierceness of a woman who'd stopped believing good things could happen and just had one happen anyway. "Papa Garrett!" Sam's voice rang through the church. "Can Thunder come to the ranch now?" Laughter broke the solemnity. Real laughter. The kind that filled a room and made it holy. The first night at the ranch, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in the big bed in the room she now shared with Garrett, listening to the sounds of a house that breathed differently than the shack. No wind cutting through walls. No cold creeping under doors. No counting the hours until the stove went dead. She got up, walked barefoot down the hall, checked each room. Emma and Lucy shared the first bedroom. Emma slept with a book on her pillow, the fables Garrett had sent in the basket. Lucy's drawings were already tacked to the wall, purple flowers and stick-figure families, and a horse that might have been Thunder. Jack had his own room for the first time in his life. He'd arranged both wooden horses on the nightstand, like sentries. His coat, the one with the patched elbow, hung on a hook by the door. He put it there himself, careful, like the room might disappear if he didn't treat it right. Hannah and Sam shared the last bedroom. Hannah slept spread across the entire bed, arms flung wide, the rag doll tucked under her chin. Sam had rolled to the floor at some point, curled up on the rug, with Thunder clutched to his chest, sleeping sounder than Clara had ever seen him sleep. She knelt beside him, adjusted the blanket, touched his hair. "You ain't hungry tonight, baby," she whispered, "and you won't be hungry tomorrow. Not ever again." She didn't hear Garrett come up behind her. Didn't know he was there until his hand settled on her shoulder, warm and steady. "They okay?" "They're perfect." Clara stood, turned to face him. In the dim hallway, his eyes caught the moonlight from the window. "Garrett, I need you to understand something." "What's that?" "I didn't marry you because of this house, or the food, or the warm beds." "I know that, Clara." "Let me finish." She pressed her hand flat against his chest, over his heart. "I married you because of a wooden horse, and a book of fables, and a note that said I was brave. I married you because you saw my children as people, not problems. Because you noticed Emma wanted to read, and Lucy needed pencils, and Jack dreamed about horses, and Hannah loved dolls, and Sam just needed something to hold on to." Her voice caught.
Thomas was a good man. He loved us. But he's gone, and I spent 2 years trying to be enough for 5 children on my own. Trying to be mother and father and provider and protector. And I was failing, Garrett. Every single day, I was failing.
You weren't failing.
I was feeding them garbage.
You were keeping them alive. There's a difference between failing and being failed by every person around you. Garrett covered her hand with his. This town failed you, Clara, not the other way around. She leaned her forehead against his chest, felt his heartbeat, strong and steady.
How did you know?
Know what?
That we needed you. That night, when you stopped your horse and looked through the wall. How did you know?
Garrett was quiet a long time. His hand moved to her hair, smoothing it gentle. Because I recognized it. The smile. The way you made nothing look like something for your children's sake. My mother used to do the same thing. Same smile, same steady hands dividing scraps. I was that boy, Clara. The one sitting at the table, believing his mama when she said there was plenty.
The flower on your porch.
The flower on our porch. His voice thickened. Somebody saved us. I never knew who. Never got to say thank you. Spent my whole life building this ranch, telling myself it was enough, telling myself success meant something. But it didn't. Not until I saw you on that floor, being the bravest person I'd ever witnessed, and realized I've been given all this abundance for a reason.
To leave baskets on a stranger's doorstep.
To find my family. Clara lifted her head, looked at him.
You found us.
You saved me.
We saved each other.
They stood in the hallway between their sleeping children and let the silence hold them. The weeks that followed reshaped the ranch in ways Garrett hadn't imagined. His house, which had been a monument to success and nothing else, became something living, something loud and chaotic and wonderful. Jack discovered the horses on the second day. Garrett found him in the barn at dawn, standing on a bucket, trying to pet the big bay gelding that was 3 times his size. Son, that horse could flatten you with one hoof.
He likes me.
Jack's face shone with certainty. He told me. Horses don't talk. This one does. He said his name is Duke, and he wants an apple. Garrett looked at the gelding. The gelding looked back with an expression of mild tolerance. His name is actually Buckshot. He likes Duke better. Garrett taught him to ride that afternoon, put him up on the gentlest mare in the string, a fat little paint named Biscuit, who moved like she was wading through honey. Jack took to it like he'd been born in a saddle. Within a week, he was trotting. Within 2, he was helping Dutch move cattle from the lower pasture. That boy's a natural, Dutch told Garrett one evening, watching Jack ride across the field with the easy seat of a born horseman. Better than most ranch hands I've hired. Don't tell him that. His head's big enough already. Too late. I already told him twice. Emma found the study. Garrett came home from fencing one afternoon to find her curled in his leather chair, surrounded by every book he owned, reading with the focused intensity of someone making up for lost time. I hope you don't mind, Clara said from the doorway, looking worried. She found the shelves and I couldn't pull her away. Mind? Garrett looked at his study, which had been a tomb of ledger books in silence for 10 years, now occupied by a 10-year-old girl with ink on her fingers and wonder in her eyes. This is the first time this room's been used for anything that matters. He bought more books, ordered them from the catalog, crates of them, everything from primers to poetry to history to adventure stories. When they arrived, Emma sat on the floor and opened each one with reverent hands, like they were Christmas presents made of gold. Papa Garrett, she looked up at him with shining eyes. There's a whole book just about birds. There's a whole world in that room, Emma. It's all yours. Lucy transformed the kitchen wall. Clara found her there one morning, drawing directly on the plaster with her pencils. A mural was taking shape. Flowers and mountains and horses and a house with smoke curling from the chimney. 7 stick figures in front of it, holding hands. Lucy Marie Sullivan. Clara's voice held the practiced shock of a mother who'd seen worse. "You're drawing on the wall." "Papa Garrett said I could." Clara turned to Garrett, who was suddenly very interested in his coffee cup. "You told her she could draw on our wall." "I told her she could draw anywhere she wanted." He met Clara's eyes over the rim. "It's just plaster, Clara. But that's art." Clara looked at the mural, at her quiet daughter's face, which glowed with a joy Lucy rarely showed, at the 7 figures holding hands, the tallest one now clearly wearing a hat. "Use the good pencils," Clara said finally, "and stay below the window line." Lucy smiled. It was the widest smile Clara had seen from her in 2 years. Hannah appointed herself official ranch greeter. Any visitor, whether Dutch or the feed delivery man, or the neighbor checking fence lines, received a formal welcome that involved a curtsy, a recitation of her name and age, and an introduction to her rag doll, whose name was Rosie, and who was, according to Hannah, the most beautiful lady in Wyoming Territory. "She gets that from you," Garrett told Clara. "The curtsying or the talking?" "The certainty that she belongs exactly where she is." Sam followed Garrett everywhere. Every morning, the boy appeared at his side like a shadow, wooden horse in one hand, the other hand reaching up for Garrett's. They walked the ranch together, checked fences, fed chickens, stood in the barn while Garrett worked, Sam providing a running commentary that consisted mostly of what Thunder thought about various situations. "Thunder says that cow looks sad. That cow always looks like that. Thunder says you should give her extra hay. Thunder's got strong opinions for a piece of wood." Sam considered this. "Thunder says you're his favorite person, after Mama." Garrett had to turn away, pretend to adjust a harness, blink until his eyes cleared. Mrs. Porter watched it all unfold with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who'd been right and knew it. She taught Clara the kitchen, not as a servant, but as a partner. They cooked together, cleaned together, ran the household as a team. "You don't have to scrub the floors yourself, Mrs. Thornton," Agnes said one morning, finding Clara on her knees with a brush. "I know I don't have to. I want to." Clara sat back on her heels. "This is my home, Agnes. First real home I've had since Thomas died. I want to take care of it with my own hands." Agnes nodded, understood something in that statement that went deeper than housework. "Well then, I'll start on the windows. We'll meet in the middle." The town shifted. Not overnight, not all at once, but the way ice broke in spring, gradual, and then sudden, and then complete. People nodded when the Thornton family passed on the street. Church ladies brought preserves and baking advice. Children from town came to play, running wild across the ranch land in packs that included Sullivan children and everyone else's, without distinction. Ida Brennan brought Clara a pie one Tuesday afternoon, stood on the porch with it in both hands, face working through emotions too complicated for words. "Apple," she said, "my mother's recipe." Clara took the pie. "Thank you, Ida." "I've been meaning to say—" Ida stopped, started again. "What I did, the talking, the gossip, I'm ashamed of it. You were struggling, and instead of helping, I made it worse. I made it ugly." "You did." Ida flinched. But Clara continued. "And now you're here, with a pie. And that matters too." "Does it? My husband used to say, people ain't what they do at their worst. They're what they do after." Clara held the door open. "You want to come in? Emma's reading aloud, and the children would love an audience." Ida Brennan stepped into the Thornton house and didn't leave for 2 hours. She came back the following Tuesday with another pie, and the Tuesday after that. It became a thing between them, not quite friendship yet, but something growing in that direction.
Something that proved people could choose to be better when someone gave them room to try. Spring arrived slow but certain. The snow pulled back from the fields like a tide going out. Green showed beneath brown. The creek began to move again, ice cracking into pieces that tumbled downstream. Garrett planted fence posts while Jack handed him nails.
Clara started a garden outside the kitchen window, pressing seeds into earth that would yield vegetables and herbs and the flowers Lucy wanted to draw from life instead of memory. One evening in late April, after the children were asleep, Garrett and Clara sat on the porch bench he'd built for her. The air smelled like wet earth and new grass. Stars scattered across the sky like someone had thrown a handful of diamonds. "I need to tell you something," Clara said. "Something I should have told you weeks ago." Garrett waited. "That morning, during the storm, when I opened the shutter and saw you riding away." She pulled her shawl tighter. "That wasn't the first time I saw you." "What do you mean?" "The very first morning. The first basket. I heard your horse. I went to the window and I saw you through the crack, setting the basket down in the dark." She turned to face him. "I knew it was you from the beginning, Garrett. From the very first day." He stared at her. "The whole time?" "The whole time. 6 weeks. You knew for 6 weeks and never said a word?" "What was I supposed to say?" Clara's voice went soft. "A stranger was saving my family." And then I realized it wasn't a stranger. It was the quiet man from the third pew who looked at my children like they mattered. Was I supposed to march up to you and ruin the most beautiful thing anyone had ever done for us? I was sneaking around like a thief. You were being kind, the purest kind of kind, the kind that don't need credit. She took his hand. I prayed every night that you'd find the courage to come forward. Not because I needed to thank you, but because I wanted to know you, the man behind the baskets. And when I knocked on your door, with the whole town watching, that's when I knew." Clara squeezed his hand. "Not the baskets, not the gifts. That moment, when you chose me over everything else, over your reputation, your standing, your comfort. You stood on my porch and knocked, and the whole world was watching, and you didn't care. I was scared half to death." "So was I. But you knocked anyway." She leaned into him. "That's what love looks like, Garrett. Not grand gestures, not speeches, just a man knocking on a door when it would be easier not to." From inside the house, a small voice drifted through the open window. Sam, talking in his sleep. "Thunder says good night, Papa Garrett." Garrett laughed. The sound surprised him, full and warm and real. The laugh of a man who'd forgotten what joy sounded like, and just remembered. Clara rested her head on his shoulder. "You know what Emma asked me today?" "What?" "She asked if she could call you Papa. Not Papa Garrett, just Papa." His breath caught. "What did you tell her?" "I told her to ask you herself." "And?" "She said she would. Tomorrow at breakfast. She's been practicing how to say it. Lucy's going to ask too." "And Jack, though he'll probably punch your arm instead of saying it because that's how Jack shows affection." "And Hannah?" "Hannah's been calling you Papa since the second day. You just haven't noticed because she says it under her breath while she's curtsying." Garrett pressed his face into Clara's hair. His shoulders shook. She held him, steady and sure, while a man who'd built an empire discovered that the only thing he'd ever wanted was this. A porch. A woman's warmth. Children sleeping safe behind him. The sound of his name, spoken by small voices who'd chosen him the same way he'd chosen them. "I spent 10 years building this ranch," he said, voice rough. "Thought it meant something. Thought the land and the cattle and the house proved I was worth something.
You are worth something.
Not because of any of that. He lifted his head, looked at the house behind them, windows glowing warm, filled with noise and life and the beautiful mess of family. Because of this. Because of you and those 5 children and this ridiculous wooden horse that runs this household. Clara laughed. The sound carried across the ranch, across the fields where snow had finally surrendered to spring, across the creek where water ran free again. You know what Thomas would have said about all this? Clara asked. Tell me. He would have said, Clara Marie, you went and found the only man in Wyoming territory stubborn enough to match you. She smiled. And then he would have shaken your hand and thanked you for keeping his family safe. I wish I could have met him. You'd have liked each other. Both quiet, both stubborn, both terrible at saying what you feel, and good at showing it. They sat in silence for a while. Stars burned bright above the ranch. Their ranch, filled with light and laughter, and the breathing of 5 children who'd gone from hunger to home in the space of a single winter. Garrett? Yeah? Thank you. For the baskets. For the books and the horses and the pencils and the doll. For the firewood in the blizzard. For the note that said, I was brave. Her voice trembled. For knocking on my door. He kissed the top of her head. Thank you for opening it. Inside the house, a lamp glowed warm in the kitchen window. Clara had put it there their first night, said she wanted anyone passing in the dark to see that light and know someone was home. Know someone was warm and safe and loved inside those walls. Garrett thought about the nameless stranger who'd left a sack of flour on a porch decades ago. About his mother's letter, never sent, still pressed in his Bible. You saved my son's life. About the chain of mercy that stretched from that unknown act of kindness to this moment, this porch, this woman, these children, this life he never knew he was building toward. Sometimes grace came in baskets left on doorsteps before dawn. Sometimes it came in second chances nobody deserved, but everybody needed. And sometimes, if you were brave enough to knock on a door when the whole world told you not to, it came in the form of a family you didn't know you were searching for. A woman who turned scraps into feasts. 5 children who turned silence into laughter. A wooden horse named Thunder who, according to Sam, approved of everything. Clara's hand found Garrett's in the dark. Her fingers laced through his, rough and thin and strong. The lamp burned steady in the window. The stars held their positions overhead. And on the porch of a ranch that was no longer empty, 2 people who'd found each other through kindness and courage and the stubborn refusal to let fear win sat together, watching spring take hold of the land, not because the world had been kind to them, but because they'd been kind to each other. And that, in the end, was the only thing that mattered, the only thing that lasted, the only thing strong enough to build a home on. The light in the window burned on, and it did not go out.